My brief is to speak about Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones in his relationship with medicine. And I will argue briefly that he was first and throughout his life a doctor of medicine. Dr. Lloyd-Jones was one of a large band of young Welshmen who went to St. Bartholomew's Hospital and other hospitals to be trained in medicine, but among them he achieved a unique distinction. The outward and visible sign of this was his recognition by Sir Thomas Horder, as he then was, who chose him as his chief assistant. We all speak of him as the doctor, but I am to speak of him as a doctor and to point out that while most of us are called doctor out of mere courtesy, he earned that title. He worked in a piece of research which I remember having to learn in pathology on a disease of the heart, and his thesis was published and awarded the MD. Likewise, he earned the degree of membership of the Royal College of Physicians. Throughout his long and distinguished career, he might have, I'm sure, have accepted many honorary degrees, but he was content to stick with his London MD, and I think this spoke volumes about him and about the way he estimated its value. His fame as a teacher spread rapidly, and I know one friend of Dr. Lloyd-Jones who, when he was a student, went from King's College Hospital to see and to hear this new teacher whose fame and ability was spoken about. Those who work in the more recently built hospitals speak lightly and frivolously of Bart's men, and they say that you can tell a Bart's man, but you can't tell him much. In this group, I hope that you will not misunderstand me when I say that Dr. Lloyd-Jones also had a certain unique distinction. But to be praised by your colleagues and your peers is praise indeed. Then suddenly he left it all for the Christian ministry and must have been one of the few doctors on his honeymoon who spent some of the time writing his first sermon. What did he take with him from his medical training? I think first that he took a method. When I first came to this building, Dr. Douglas Johnson sent me along to the conference hall behind here and told me that I would see a medical teacher using the method of arriving at a diagnosis and discussing management, but doing it in the context of Christian issues and a Christian church. And there are many, many conferences, not only in England and Wales, but throughout the world, where his unique ability, learned at the bedside and in the setting of medical training, have been seen and have been enormously beneficial. And many a young student who thought he knew a lot learned very quickly that he didn't really know enough. He then, I think, brought another thing from his medical training. I believe that he brought the microscope from the laboratory to the study and to the pulpit. And it is my view that his expository gift owed much to his dissection under the microscope of the text of Scripture before he could declare it and apply it on the grand prophetic scale. There was an organization, there still is, called the Christian Medical Fellowship, in which he also had a unique opportunity to use his medical knowledge, skills, and gifts. For many years, he was an acknowledged leader. If the CMF had bishops and apostles, I'm sure he would have been among the leading ones. He was, for many years, a source of great wisdom and knowledge for the study group, which resulted in the publication of many pamphlets and books which are now accepted as standard. But I want to mention three further things about his place, how his place in medicine affected his ministry. First as a scientist, then as a counselor, and lastly as a person. First as a scientist, many of you may not know how much he read, how deeply and how widely, how encyclopedic and up-to-date his medical knowledge was. I mentioned three ways in which, because he was a doctor, God, in my view, blessed his ministry, particularly in the church. First, his attack on Freudian psychoanalysis. Now, anyone who is capable of writing a paperback will quote Karl Popper, Peter Medower, and others who point out that Freudian psychology is a false religion. But Dr. Lloyd-Jones, when he wrote his preface to The Menace of the New Psychology so many years ago, recognized and spoke plainly about the dangers of this movement. Secondly, in his opposition to the ministry of healing, those of you who are here will, I hope, know that Dr. Lloyd-Jones believed in divine healing. What he opposed was a so-called ministry which devalued and debased some of the scriptural concepts. I once spoke to a surgeon who had given up his career at a late stage to work for the ministry of healing, who said to me, "But for one man, our ministry would have swept the church," and I need not tell you who that man was. And the third way in which I think his scientific knowledge was put to use was in his opposition to the misuse of psychology. In the 30s, when he was establishing himself in the ministry, and in the 40s, when so many of the sermons preached by the weathercocks in the churches who reflected the winds of psychology that were changing so rapidly, Dr. Lloyd-Jones stood out against turning the gospel into a sort of cheap psychology. And even with psychiatrists, he was not at all averse to do battle. Those of you who have known his book, Conversions, Psychological and Spiritual, will know that when Dr. William Sargent wrote his bestseller, The Battle for the Mind, he was the only one who wrote from the Christian and evangelical point of view an adequate answer in the form of a lecture given to evangelical ministers. I think that he preserved this enormous scientific knowledge and curiosity about all real advances in his field to the end. It was not only saving grace that he was proud to declare, but he found God's common grace equally amazing. Secondly, he was a counsellor. He may have left the fame and the professional heights of St. Bartholomew's Hospital and the wealth of Harley Street and international acclaim. But in my view, he had a larger and more important practice than he would otherwise have had. Those who came to him for counselling benefited from his enormous skill in disentangling the strands of physical, psychological, and spiritual aspects of their problems. His ability to do this was partly, in my view, because of his medical training. We will never know how many owe him and his family a debt for time given in his study and on the telephone and in many different preaching journeys that he took, where he was literally sometimes besieged by those who came to him for counselling and for help, and they could count on it. Lastly, how did his medical training affect him as a person? He might not have agreed with Phillips Brooks' definition that preaching was truth expressed through personality, but there is some truth, I think, in it. He deplored the cult of personality, yet to many of us we could not fail to find him our hero, and we loved him, and alas, we imitated him. It was in his medical training that it became true of him, as Dr. André Schlemmer said of somebody else, that he was a terrible judge in regard to ideas, but full of charity towards persons. Dr. Lloyd-Jones's mind had enough intellectual power to drive several turbines. It might, had it not been strictly and medically trained under God's providential guidance, simply have made a bigger splash. But his mind was not a waterfall wasting its power. As the following speakers will show you, I hope as briefly as I've tried to do, he managed to drive several turbines. Dr. Lloyd-Jones was like his Lord, content when the common people heard him gladly. But he also treated them kindly, and he was good to all, especially those of the household of faith. In this, as is much else, it is true of him, in the words of Wordsworth, that I heard him quote from this pulpit first of all. He was a type of the wise who saw but never roam, true to their kindred points of heaven and home.